welcome our viewing audience that's out there on cyberspace. Thank you for joining. This is Philip Cohen with Mansfield Equities here in Los Angeles, and I'm joined today with hopefully a familiar panel because we did this back in July. So I have Sandy Siegel from Newmark Merrill, who's joining us from kind of a retail perspective, Peter Linneman with Linneman and Associates. And Peter, you're located, are you in New York?
Philadelphia.
You're in Philly.
Blocks from Independence Hall.
Okay, you're in Philly. We're still waiting for the vote count. And we got Sean in New York, who's with Expo City. And want to thank you guys for joining us once again. I thought it'd be a good idea just to kind of huddle up again after July. And I think back then we were kind of throwing the kitchen sink at COVID and the like. And maybe we still are, but it's certainly good to check in now that we may be past the election. Maybe we may be, depending how Sean's going to read the second wave, but we certainly are. We've made a lot of progress in vaccines. So I think our goal today is to really try to hit it all. Okay, we're going to try to hit it all. And Peter, we're going to try to do 1,000 solutions to 1,000 problems within an hour. So having said all that, let's kick it off. I think last time we started with Sandy. This time I'd like to start with Peter. And Peter, I'll start with a question, but I'll let you take it any way you want. It's interesting. There's still a lot of carnage on the streets here. I'm sure, we can hear from Sandy about some of his tenants. Still a struggle with landlords with collecting rents. There's obviously still a lot of credit issues with hospitality, with retail. The sports stadiums are still empty, unfortunately. And the disconnect I see between Main Street and Wall Street has never been greater. Wall Street just keeps running up and up and up. Maybe take us back to where we were in July, where we are today. Are we in a recovery? Where are we going? And maybe address kind of Main Street versus Wall Street.
Okay, and I won't speak specifically to retail because Sandy, you can pick that up. So I'll stay broader, okay? We had a very sharp comeback as we eliminated the most draconian lockdown the measures in our history. And that's not surprising. And I think I may have said in our session, if not, I did in others, that think about it, we shut down elective medical. Elective medical is about 15% of American society, right? And we shut that as well as many other things down. Well, once you unlocked elective medical, you got 15% of the economy back within a month or two. It's not 100% back. Elective medical is probably 95% back. So that was huge. And knock on and knock on. At the other extreme is going international travel. That's the other extreme. And it's not basically come back at all, either because you can't do it or you won't do it even if you can. Those are the extremes. And after we had that initial snapback, I said, now it's going to be a butterfly recovery from here. Because people were saying, would it be a swoosh or a V? The first part was easy because we shut down huge swaths that didn't need to be shut down. Then what you're still left with is, I don't know. And what will the government do? I'm sure we'll talk about schools. I'm sure we're going to talk about retail. I'm sure we're going to talk about. So there are these sectors. And I said, it's going to be a butterfly recovery. Somebody said, what's that? Literally, think of how a butterfly moves. Goes up, down, sideways, backwards, stops, forward. It does make progress. It does make it slowly. It makes it haltingly. And that's what we've had for the last 2.5 months, is a butterfly recovery. So, for example, we've just gone backwards. How did we just go backwards? They closed a bunch of schools. They closed, Sandy, I'm sure you'll talk about it. They closed a bunch of retail, not everywhere, but some places. And so it's going to be a butterfly recovery. I'm sure, Sean, you're going to speak about it, is on the other hand, there are vaccines coming out there that are quite high in efficacy. And I'll end my opening comment, Phil, by saying, where are we? It feels like it must have felt in November 1944. Everybody was fatigued around the world from war. Lots of death and carnage, real death and real carnage, physical destruction as well as economic destruction. People were tired of it. Anybody objective saw that Japan had lost. Anybody objective saw Germany had lost, but Germany and Japan had not surrendered. And a lot of death and destruction was yet to occur. And you don't want to be the person to die the last day of the war, whether it's a human death or a business death. And in November 1944, people said it's going to be over by Christmas, and others said it's going to be 18 months. That's the vaccine. It's not going to be by Christmas that it's going to be over, but it's going to be over or under control. That doesn't mean deaths end. That doesn't mean carnage end. It means this systemic ends. So I think that's my analogy, a butterfly, November 1944. Remember, after November 1944 was the Battle of the Bulge, the most deaths of Americans in the war. Iwo Jima, the most to die in one day. Okinawa, atomic bombs, deaths picked up in the prison camps, in the concentration camps, and the Battle of Berlin and all the stuff on the Eastern Front. We got a distance to go. So with that, I'll yield and you can go from there, Phil.
Okay, fair enough. Good. We'll do that. We'll swing it over to Sandy and get kind of a live report on his activity. Sandy, I would like you to mention your recent acquisition, the Carson Mall, and talk about how you're running things over there. A little feedback from your tenants since we last talked, and maybe also talk a little bit about how your underwriting budget's looking ahead in 2021.
Right. Well, those are all easy topics. So let's start where Peter ended, which is that I totally agree, and I've used those analogies multiple times, but not as eloquently as Peter. So, thanks for that, Peter. Look, I think there's a couple things. I write a Thanksgiving message every year, and I had a hard time this year because we've had some real personal losses, and we've had business losses, and we've had, as we were talking earlier, things are going to take a long time to recover. Seniors who've been locked up and isolated, mental health things, school, the educational gap that we've created is going to go on for a long time, much past the vaccine period. So, but what are we thankful for? I mean, one of the things I can demonstrate is it turned out that our tenants were much more creative than we gave them credit for. That the desire to survive was very, very strong. I see it, in a lot of ways, you sort of feel like you're back to April because of the case counts and the shutdowns and everything else. But I think it's totally different, okay, in a couple important respects. One is, I think tenants have really adapted and found ways that they can succeed. So our outdoor dining, our delivery business, our buy, online, pickup, curbside, all those things have gone. The adaption of technology. I mean, you cannot believe how hard I tried for 4 or 5 years to get people to use social marketing, only to have them jump on in the last 3 or 4 months. How positive that's been. We use technology to monitor our traffic counts at every one of our centers. We're able to monitor it. And, I was just talking to our company, for the last 4 weeks, we have had steady week over week gains in traffic coming back to our centers. But more importantly, we've seen week over week gains for about 6 weeks of year over year increases. So same period last year to same period this year, about 25% of our portfolio has more traffic than it had a year ago. So, I think that there's, innovation has really pushed things forward. Now, the shutdown, obviously, California, I'm in 3 states. I'm in California, Colorado, and Illinois. The shutdowns are real. I mean, I spent a fortune. I've spent, close to $1 million on outdoor dining as an example, only to have LA County decide to shut it down this week. I personally think it's a huge mistake. I know we're focused on positive tests, but, if you compare mortality related to getting sick and how that's working, we're doing an incredibly good job on getting people keeping people from going to the hospital when they get to the hospital, getting treatment, and getting them out. But again, I think we'll come out of this with a much better outdoor dining experience, much better online experience, much more connected experience. But like Peter said, and I say to our tenants and I say to our staff all the time, it really sucks to be the last person killed in the battlefield, right? I mean, that's the worst of the worst. And, for me, it's a little bit like, I don't know who's seen Saving Private Ryan, but if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, there's a scene right at D-Day where this guy is going up and he's bleeding out, and the medics save his life and say, "We stopped the bleeding, we saved him," and the guy gets shot in the head. That's a little bit how I felt, this weekend. I'm like, for God's sakes, let's give these guys a way forward. Now, one of the things that could solve a lot of these things is if our knucklehead leaders could pass a stimulus bill, because PPP went a lot farther than we thought the first go around. It took a while to get it right. Everyone agrees, let's get a stimulus bill done, but we can't seem to get one done. I still believe it's out there. But then again, I'm a little bit of an optimist. That stimulus bill could be the entire difference between getting from here to a vaccine, lowering rates and reducing restrictions. So, for those of us in real estate, and maybe I said on our last panel, but I've said 100 times, between, we do a shit job as real estate people advocating for what we mean to society overall. We are, and you can see it on ballot measures, we are constantly demonized as the rich guys, either screwing the small guys by kicking them out or by taking advantage of communities. And we just got to do a better job on messaging there. So I think that's my high level overview. Unless Phil, you want me to answer anything?
That's fine. You mentioned stimulus. Sean gave you a thumbs up, and I'll kick it to Sean or Peter. Maybe what's the scope of the stimulus, and can we afford all this borrowed spending only to pass it on to our children or grandchildren at the end of the day?
So let me just briefly make an observation about that and a comment. I reversed that question and I said we cannot afford
not
to have a stimulus package. To Sandy's point, I believe there's a great deal of damage that has been done because of what I call the politics of the pandemics over the course of the last few months, because of the fact that the stimulus package didn't pass. Now, let me give you one facet of the stimulus package. It's not just all about economy, it's about lives. So we know that the minorities, African Americans, Latinos, and even Asians are disproportionately affected in terms of mortality and morbidity. 40% of the morbidity comes from those communities. Now, there are many reasons for this because there's a lot of narratives that was being used as propaganda during the election process that how badly the administration has botched this. And one of the points that was being made was that why is it that the United States of America is 5% of the global population, but fully 20% of the morbidity? Well, the reason is we are nothing like any Asian country. We're nothing like South Korea, Japan, China. We're nothing like any European country. There is no homogeneous nature to the demographics in the US. The US is an amalgamation of many different nations. Now, when you look at the minority groups, what you understand is that unfortunately they have a higher rate of high-risk conditions, the comorbidities such as obesity and diabetes and cancer. Now, so what happens
Ron,
is,
just if I could interject, we may be 4% of the world's population. We're 90% or 95% of the world's obese population.
right, that's another factor. When you look at those factors, it's a completely misleading statement to compare the morbidity in the US. But just focusing on the community, obviously the people who work at UPS, a lot of the essential workers come from these communities that should have the stimulus package and stimulus checks so that those who are at high risk can stay home. When you don't have the money and you have to go work, that is why and how it is that we have higher rates of morbidity. I have some slides later on that I go through this, but the stimulus is an absolutely essential thing. You can't think of the next generation. It's too late for that. We have to go ahead and fix the problem now.
Peter, I heard you recently speak about the affordability of the stimulus package and what it costs to the next generation. Maybe just run the audience through. But before you do that, I just want to just interject real quick. Anyone that's listening out there, feel free to chat me a question or whatnot that I can share with the audience. And also, Peter, before you get, I just want to give a quick shout out and thank you to Fidelity. Fidelity's mortgage is a local LA based, but really California or West Coast centric mortgage company, kind of short-term bridge money. And they've been a great sponsor for Mansfield Equities throughout when we used to go live in our LA hotels and whatnot to bring this group together. We used to get about 180 people. Now we're actually growing this because we're now East Coast and West Coast, thanks to bringing guys like Sean and Peter here. So I want to thank Fidelity. They basically, just real quick, their advertisement pitch, 50,000 to 20 million. Their rates are around 8.5%. And interest only. They can amortization, very flexible, very quick. And I just want to thank Neil and his company for helping out today. Okay, Peter, back to you.
Oh, terrific. Of course we can afford it. Just a couple of notions. I think we've spent about 3 trillion. They're talking about another 2 trillion. And let's say they do another 3 trillion in 2021. All right. So 8 trillion. And you'll see why I take 8 to make the math simple. 8 trillion, GDP, roughly 20 trillion, right? By the way, the total debt we would have with that 8 trillion would be about 26 trillion, which means we could pay off 100% of our debt with a year and a third of income. I mean, that's pretty remarkable if you could pay off your debt with a year and a third of income, right? Then you say, okay, the interest cost on $8 trillion debt funded for 30 years, roughly $100 billion at today's interest rates. The federal budget in 2019 was 4.3 trillion. And nobody would have known if it's 4.3 or 4.2 or 4.4. It's rounding here, okay? I'm not trying to be trivial about it, but we can fund it in that sense. And the third point is that if you did the present value of the US economy, right? Just a classroom exercise, $20 trillion economy growing nominally at 4.5%, low risk over the long term, you're going to come up with a number like $800 trillion present value. $800 trillion present value, a 40 multiple, just for a quick number, right? To spend 8 trillion today to alleviate pain and suffering and to keep people and businesses alive and the economy alive, 1% of our total wealth, our real wealth, our present value, of course. And so the issue is not whether we can afford it. Of course we can afford it. All of us would have gladly given 1% of our wealth if we could have alleviated the pain and suffering of our ancestors during the Great Depression. Of course we would have, right? You wouldn't have thought twice. So the real question is, do we get our money's worth? Is it wasteful political spending or is it productive social spending? Round one was the most effective federal government spending I've seen in my lifetime. It was not being allocated to who's the Speaker of the House and who's got the Appropriations Committee, etc. They actually did real things. Did they do them perfectly? Of course not, but private spending isn't perfect either, right? Round two, more political. And I don't mean Democrat, Republican so much as I want my little goodie. So this second round will occur. It will be more political, less of our money's worth. And subsequent rounds will get even more political and we'll get even less for our money. But so far, we are getting our money. And certainly, if it's spent the way Sandy and Sean are implying, we're getting our money's worth. What else can you ask for in life? Then you get your money's worth. Our disappointment in life as consumers, whether it's the government providing it or a retailer providing it, is did I get my money's worth? It's that simple.
And how do you articulate money's worth since we had the last stimulus package based on where unemployment was? I think the last time we talked it was around 22% to where we are today. How would you spin the return on stimulus spending for our viewers?
Well, it's been very good. It's been very good. And I think, as I say, it's not been perfect, but it's been extremely good. By the way, do you think the Russian mafia figured out a way to rip off PPP? Of course. Of course. And that's going to be what the newspaper articles are going to be about in 2021, right?
Yeah.
Is how that occurred.
Phil, let me tell you how I would mention. Okay. First
Good.
of all, we did an exercise to figure out how many jobs our tenants did. Okay. So our tenants generated between 60 to 70,000 jobs. Okay. So let's just think of it from a jobs perspective and what it meant every time you lose a tenant to that number overall and what those people do with the money they get from their jobs, right? So we had 800 tenants apply. The rest of our tenants were credit worthy or couldn't apply. Well, we had 800 who were eligible. We got 600 who ended up applying. It started very slow, but because it was complicated, but we eventually got up to 600. Of the 600 that got PPP, we permanently lost 10 of them. 10. Okay. So think about what those 600 people have gone through. Think about the likely outcome of what would happen to those 600. And we lost 10 of them. So, if you would have asked me at the time before PPP and when we were trying to get people through SBA, I would have said, that rung, we would lose easily 20%. Okay. But we didn't. So I'm in total agreement, Peter. I think, the criticism applies to, such a small fraction. Yes, you got to agree that there's some waste and normal spending. Like Peter says, I have an ex-wife and a fiance, so there's no waste there's a waste in my personal spending too. But at the end of the day, that money went to people who then paid their bills, paid us, kept their employees, and when they opened, were able to physically open. Okay. Right. My fear is, and I think this is a real fear, and I go to Sean's point of how can you not do stimulus? What's the argument against stimulus? Where do these people get the money to reopen again and again and again? I mean, they're out of money. So, and the consumer, if they could open, the consumer's out of money. So it has to go in the system. It has to.
By the way, just one small footnote to what Sandy said. You do understand that a lot of that money, whether it was unemployment money that was topped up, et cetera, went to state and local budgets to the extent they got sales taxes, to the extent they got income taxes. Unemployment benefits were taxed in almost every place that has an income tax, right? So it went a lot of productive places.
Right. Since we hit the stimulus and I guess bang for your buck, I want to go back for Sandy for a second. Sandy, let's just kind of get down to brass tacks. You bought 180,000 square foot mall, the old Carson Mall, but had some interesting credits in there. Maybe walk us through your transaction sort of perspective. Why'd you bought that? What was good about it? And I think you mentioned you might have another deal in escrow to buy. Talk to us about buying. How do you underwrite today and so forth?
Well, look, I mean, I'll start by saying that, I may have been temporarily intoxicated on drugs or just, suffering from some sort of mental defect, but
very smart.
Yeah, or it could be that. Well, I'll let the audience and you guys decide. I'm not as smart as you guys. So look, here is our dynamic. Okay, we are real data hounds here. I mean, we have two things going for us that I think have served us well in during COVID. Not perfect. Again, we're suffering, but two things. One is we had a crap load of data going into this scenario, and we've had a crap load of data while we've been going through it. And when I say a lot of data, I mean, we know where people are shopping, how long they stay, what stores they go to, not just at our centers, at other centers and everything else. And we're using, we use facial recognition, we use cell phone data. We have a lot of good data. Okay, so that's number one. Okay. Number two, we're very operational as a company. We're not transactional. We operate for the long term. So we're very much in touch with our tenants. So, I was in escrow, and just for clarity, Carson Mall, which is down here in South LA, right off the 405 freeway, some busy traffic, is broken into a few pieces. I didn't buy the whole mall. The mall is owned, the interior portion of the mall is owned by somebody different than us. We have in the past tried to buy that. One of the oldest centers I've ever owned is in Carson, just south of Freeway Market Drug Center. So I was offered the former Sears building, which is now a Burlington, a Ross, some outdoor drive-in stuff, and some other parts, but a lot of land right off the freeway, good density. And I looked at it and I said, okay, great credit tenants, my Ross, my DDs, my Burlingtons have all been doing great. There's, if there's going to be a recession, there's going to be more quest for value. This is a value-oriented community. I got a college to my north, which eventually will be reopened. Cal State Dominguez Hills. I got a stadium, a soccer stadium. I got a lot of things going for me, and I'm buying it. I don't want to violate confidentiality, but I'm buying it where there's a huge spread. Let's call it 500 basis points between debt and what I'm acquiring it for. So you look at that and you go, I'm getting compensated pretty well for risk. I understand my risk. I like the neighborhood. If God forbid there's no such thing as retail, which believe me, that would cause me a lot bigger problems in this particular center. There's a lot I can do with this piece of property. Okay. And by the way, the mall and everything else, it's all a puzzle, and I'm part of that puzzle. So besides just owning retail, I also have a kind of a call on the balance of the center. So that's why I bought that. And yeah, it's difficult to value, difficult to get a loan, everything's difficult, right? Because people hate uncertainty, and you can't have more uncertainty. That being said, I'm an escrow to buy another deal in Illinois. Why? Has 2 supermarkets as part of the deal. Has a bunch of off-priced as part of it. Very low cost per foot. Same thing. So that's the logic.
The contrarian would say that if you have cash, because it's difficult finding debt in retail. We were in the market on a shadow anchored Albertsons deal, and just very difficult. The lenders want grocery anchor today because that's where the credit is. That's the foot traffic. And short of that, it's very challenging. If you have a good credit single tenant, you're getting that kind of money. But I imagine, Sandy, you kind of went in with low leverage. And if you can do that, then it's a great buying opportunity, because rates have come down a little bit since we last talked. Yields, spreads, cap rates have probably shot up a little bit. So if you were at 400 basis points or 300 basis points maybe a year ago, the 500 maybe makes it a more interesting buy today.
Well, yeah. Well, look, I think 2 things. One is, yes, that's terribly hard to come by, but that's where relationships pay off, where I've had long-term relationships. That's one thing. Second thing is, look, if I owned only 2 shopping centers, would this be my third? I don't think so. If you own 80 shopping centers and you say, look, in the mix, I'm going to take a little bit of a risk and improve my spread, no, I mean, it makes sense. It's not, it's not going to kill you.
What's the biggest line item in your budgets that you're hitting your property managers for 2021 to be conservative on?
What am I knocking them down on?
I mean, what versus a year ago when there was no COVID, what's the one issue? Is it just collections and bad debt, or what's the one issue here?
Well, I mean, there's no one issue. I mean, that's the problem. Collections are bad, but I think most people tell you collections have been better than we budgeted. I mean, by a long shot. Okay, so I think we've got an artificial kind of thing there, and I could plummet. So I think there's a big issue there. I think, look, we sit in these budget meetings. I just finished 85 of them, and the key is, if traffic's going to be 50% of this year, next year, then we shouldn't be having as much custodial, trash pickup, and security. But you got to be reactive. What's happening? So I mean, that's sort of where we've been looking. But we're also upped our promotion and outreach budget. So and our PPE, things like that.
Right. All right. I want to move a little bit to Sean's world here. So Sean, I want to, since we're in the middle of a transition period, we think with the election and whatnot. So maybe you could comment a little bit on what President-elect, if I can say that, quoting Fox and CNN and the others. What does that world look like for owners like Sandy, for shoppers, let's say like you and I, for some of the projects you're involved with? Talk about President Biden, and then maybe you could tailspin into the vaccine conversation and some charts.
So, I think that for all the real estate people, I don't care whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Independent, the policies that have been proposed by President-elect Biden are troubling, to say the least. So we know, for example, that the corporate tax rates are proposed to go up from 21% to 28%. Individual income tax rates could be as high as 53%. And that's without the state effect, which in places like New York, it can take you up to 60%. Then you'll have the elimination of capital gain, elimination of 1031 exchanges, which is a huge blow to the industry. I have some thoughts about how to manage that, but you have the increase to capital gains tax rates, which is also not so much fun for the people in the industry. And finally, you got the fact that one of the proposed policies, which affects everyone who's had a portfolio like Sandy or the rest of us, is the fact that the exemption for estate and gift tax for a married couple would go down from 23 million to 11.5 million. That's a huge impact on people who were counting on passing on their legacy and their inheritance without taxation. So the combination of those issues really poses a challenging environment for real estate owners. I personally have no problem that we have a change of guard, so to speak. However, I'm also in favor of a divided government. I am hoping that the Senate stays in the control of Republicans. That's not a political statement. That is, I believe most of America believes in checks and balances. And I think when you have a new force that wants to shift things so radically in one direction, it's good to have a counterbalance. So with a divided government, assuming that the Senate stays within the control of the Republicans, a lot of these things that I discussed becomes more academic, and we'll see what happens after that.
Right. All right.
By the way, if I could just throw in one thing,
yeah.
The upcoming Georgia runoffs are critical. Remember, I live in Pennsylvania. From basically July until the day after the election, I saw no advertisements for anything on any media except political. It was remarkable. It was just remarkable. Do you understand that the people in Georgia aren't going to see an ad for Coca-Cola? They aren't going to see the little polar bears, They're not going to know Walmart exists or Target exists. They're not going to know automobiles exist as a product that's advertising. They're not even going to get Super Bowl ads, I'm afraid, because that comes later, I guess. But the point is, they're going to get $500 million to $1 billion in advertising spent in that state, which is an enormous waste of money. But it's staggering what those poor people are going to have to endure.
The good news, though, Peter, is that if you're living in Georgia and you follow the Atlantic Falcons, if you don't know that they're 3-7, that's a good thing, actually.
Hey, listen, 3-7, you can be in first place in the
That's
division.
right. In the NFC East, you can be in first place at 3-7. What an upside down world. That's right.
But
That's
on a serious note about what Peter said, Georgians also believe in checks and balances. So I believe that the final result in the runoffs would keep the Senate in the control of the Republicans, because obviously Georgia has been a red state to start with, and it has turned, but I don't believe that applies to the congressional races.
Sean, and Sean and Peter, for that matter, maybe you can comment on, I mean, there's just been this incredible proliferation of, we talked about COVID and the spread of it. And I have friends that work in hospitals. And in fact, those hospitals that have been relatively dormant of COVID, they are seeing more COVID patients now, and respirators and whatnot. So there's this alarming rate across the country. I think we just had 150 to 170,000 positive tests in a day, and mortality is up, whatnot. At the same time, there's this incredible proliferation of positive news that Wall Street is eating up about the vaccine. So maybe talk about the kind of the collision of these two worlds, about vaccines, the distribution, and ultimately, obviously, that's going to feed its way into Sandy's world, the tenants, and reopening the country again. Why don't you tackle that?
Let me let Sean, you react to the vaccines. I know we all follow them, but let me let you react to that. Let me react to this general comment about Wall Street being disconnected. I don't think it's disconnected. I don't know that it is connected ever, but I'm not sure it's disconnected. And we had tremendous amount of money during the financial crisis that was pumped in by QE1, QE2, QE3. People said we got no inflation. That is wrong. We got tremendous inflation between 2009 and 2019. It was asset price inflation, not consumer price inflation. And when you go back and look at your textbook about what inflation it is the on average movement of prices, not consumer prices. And we just got used to counting consumer prices as the metric. And what happened is the banking system that got the money is not set up to lend money to buy Cheerios. So why would Cheerios go up in prices? It's not chasing that. The banking system that got created is highly concentrated and is set up to make big loans for assets. And whether those assets are real estate, homes, commercial cash streams, or corporations. So if you look back on gold and silver and real estate and home prices and
gas,
stock prices, and bond prices, and so they all went up notably 2009 to 19. We have repeated pumping that money into the system again. Where do you think it'll come out over the next decade? Asset prices or consumer prices? It is set up to lend to people chasing assets much more than it's set up to people chasing goods and services. And the joke I make, and I really do make this, is that imagine that instead of giving all that money to the banks, you gave it to one 16-year-old boy, right? You gave $4 trillion to one 16-year-old boy. What would go up in price? I don't think you'd see Wonder Bread go up in price. You'd see games, video games. You'd see, a car that he could buy, et cetera, she could buy. The money chases what it's been given to chase, and that's assets. If you believe that you're going to get a follow-on asset price inflation, assume that's true. Do you suddenly believe Wall Street is so disconnected? Because I got to get there before it happens.
Right. Okay, I guess that's relatively bullish, and hopefully that means that Sandy's property managers can underwrite 3% increases in rent.
And not only that, what he can underwrite is cap rates compressing,
right,
rather than what I'm sure you modeled, which is expanding. Right.
Okay, Sean.
Yeah, so I think maybe this is a good segue for me to share some slides about where we were and where we're going. So if Zaman could enable screen sharing, okay. I'm going to share some slides.
You could do the old Ross Perot version, just hold it in front of the camera, you know?
That's too.
I may be the only one who remembers who Ross Perot was.
That's-
May he rest in peace.
All right, so very quickly, so I started this blog back in March and called Tunnel at the End of the Light. And the idea was that we had the light and then we hit a tunnel and we have to go through the tunnel. So interestingly, when we met last time in July, here were the stats. There was a total of 14 million confirmed cases globally, 610,000 deaths globally. In the US, it was 3.8 million cases and 140,000 deaths. Now let's look at where we are today. It's nearly 60 million cases globally, 1.4 million deaths globally. There is 12 million cases in the US and 250,000, about 250,000 deaths. Now, all of that looks bad until you sort of put it in perspective. A lot of, as we discussed, a lot of this is skewed towards Americas, and that's not just North America, it also includes South America. But Europe as a whole is not that far behind. Interestingly, even Southeast Asia is not that far behind. When you get to Northeast Asia, which is China, Japan, and South Korea, it's a totally different story because it's such a homogeneous sort of nations. And we know China obviously has the tools of forcing people to do things that we don't have in the US. Now, interestingly, if you look at the number of deaths, yes, they have gone up, but there is good news, and I want to sort of like look at it from two perspectives. This period discussed, I'm not going to cover it, but there is the idea that it's going to take 10 years before we get back to the same place that we would have been had COVID not happened. Now, there's been this discussion about, was it a V-shaped recovery, is it not? We saw that, when we were meeting, we were thinking that it was a V-shaped recovery. But then if you look at what happened in September and October, we had some dips in September and October, which makes it more like a W-shaped recovery. I think that's for the most part done, thanks to the fact that the vaccines are finally here, available before the year end. And there is an expectation by the Operation Warp Speed head that through May of next year, we should be able to vaccinate 70% of the population, which would get you at 95% efficacy, would get you to herd immunity. Okay. Now we see what happened in the 1918 Spanish flu. There were 3 waves. We definitely are in the middle of the second wave. I had written a paper on this, expecting that in fall and winter we would have it, and of course we had it. The number of cases now being higher than before, as are the number of deaths. But here's a very interesting graphic that I think it really tells a very different story. The deep red is the mortality of Spanish flu, the 1918 flu. Okay, so if compare that deep red to the deep blue, which is the mortality of COVID-19, and those are female, the lighter red and lighter blue is male. The bottom axis is the ages. What you see with the Spanish flu, the majority of the deaths were amongst the younger people, even under 10 years of age, but certainly 10 to 40. And the majority of the older people were not affected. Whereas with the COVID-19, the majority of deaths are with people over the age of 60. There is a very important comparison. If you look at the rate of mortality per 100,000, and the Spanish flu was 646 in the US, COVID-19 is 79. we are orders of magnitude under the mortality of Spanish flu. Same thing globally was even far, far less, 18 versus 2780. Now that becomes important when you compare the number of cases for those who are 60 and above. So 90% of the cases in the United States are people who are 60 and above. And that group, 60 and above, represents 80% of the deaths. Now that's an important statistic because when we talk about protecting the high-risk people, there are so many different ways to categorize people based on age and comorbidities such as obesity and diabetes and cancer, and do away with 80% of the deaths. Now I say that because we see that there has been actually, if you compare the number of deaths above what would normally have been, it's actually gone down and it's going to continue to go down because we finally have these three leading candidates, Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca. Pfizer and Moderna claim 95% efficacy, which is unheard of. The polio vaccine, which was one of the most successful vaccination programs in the world, had a 90% efficacy. AstraZeneca is kind of a mixed thing, which is why the stock is down today. On the one hand, with a certain dosage, it's 70% efficacy. They claim with a mixed dosage, it's 90%, we'll see. But these vaccines are the reason why the stock market continues to go up. The more important thing until everyone is vaccinated is the therapeutics. We finally have Regeneron and Eli Lilly's monoclonal antibodies, which basically means people with moderate to severe cases in the hospitals finally have something that will save their lives. Now, all of this I call for a new way of thinking. I call creative disruption. What Sandy described to me is creative disruption. How he picked out of a mall a certain portion of it that he's comfortable with. I wrote this paper called Totally Out of Control. I say in the paper, it's not the pandemic, but it's the pandemic politics. And I cite this very interesting article. By the way, both the paper and this article, I'm going to make available to Phil to distribute to whomever wants it. This is a very important paper, in my opinion, as to how to deal with COVID-19 going forward. It's entitled A Sensible and Compassionate Anti-COVID Strategy. Three professors, one from Stanford, one from Harvard, and one from Oxford, have reached a declaration they call the Great Barrington Declaration, which essentially posits that what we need to do is forget about lockdowns. Lockdown was okay for this year in order to get the hospitals into shape. But going forward, isolate those people 65 and above who have comorbidities, have them stay at home, provide them with the stimulus checks that they can afford to stay at home, and then let everyone else go back to work, go to life as it was. Of course, wearing masks, socially distancing, washing hands, but let life proceed. And with that, I believe it's going to make a huge difference, even if we cover these tax issues that would come up if Biden's policies are adopted. It's going to make a huge difference in terms of the economy.
Very good. So then, Sean, just as a follow-up, what about distribution of these vaccines?
So I completely believe that despite all the criticism of the current administration, no one is giving credit to the current administration for Operation Warp Speed, throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at it. That is now in a position that, again, according to the head of the operation, by May of next year, assuming we don't have the anti-vaxxers do their propaganda machine, which is not a sure thing. We could get 70%. There is enough dosage for 70% of US population to be inoculated. And that's huge.
Look, here's what's going to happen. I was listening to something the other day. Look, the hospitals require already that all their employees get flu shots. They're going to require all their employees, medical, going to require it. Schools require whatever the MMR, and so they're going to require it. You're
Major
then going to get, you had this, apparently I'm going to say something like May, 75% of Americans said they would take the vaccine as soon as it was available. Then you had this political exercise about it wouldn't be safe and this and that. It's down to like 45%. That was shameful on behalf of the Democrats in that case, because they knew the companies were not going to do reckless things and get sued into oblivion. They knew they were going to be checked. That'll go up. What I suspect is if you want to fly on an airplane next year by about June, show me you're vaccinated. If you want to go into a movie theater in one of Sandy's movie theaters, just show me you're vaccinated. If you want to go indoors in my full restaurant, it's easy. Show me you're vaccinated.
How about if you want to renew your license at DMV? Is that
Absolutely.
really?
And by the way, if you don't, that's fine. You know, if you don't want to eat indoors at one of Sandy's restaurants, great. Don't get vaccinated. And I think what's going to happen is you're going to get it driven largely by private exercise, at least in the beginning. Now, you can't do that until it's widely available, right? Until it's somewhat available. But once it's somewhat available, you want to eat in a full restaurant? Great. Just show me your little card or your little whatever, That will go a long way. And by the way, I think Kamala Harris was one of the people who said she wouldn't get vaccinated. By the way, you know she'll be the second person in line.
Yeah, and Governor Cuomo says that he has to test it based on his own scientists, which is absolute nonsense. I want to give another example to Peter's point. Las Vegas, Nevada is paralyzed, not because of tourists not flying to Las Vegas, they're driving in from California. It's paralyzed because the most important part of the casino resort business is the midweek business, which is the corporate business, trade shows, and corporate events. Now, the governor of Nevada, Governor Sisolak, essentially is afraid of his own shadow. So he has this policy, which he enacted again yesterday. It keeps going down. It was 50% capacity, nice 25% capacity, no more than 50 people. That's all ludicrous. All you need to do is what Peter said. Anyone who wants to go to the trade show, show me that you're vaccinated. And that's it. And open it up.
All the indoor stuff gets, you want to go see the Lakers play this year indoors? Real easy. Just, they already are doing metal detection, right? In all these arenas. How hard it is, you're going to get a little card. Will there be counterfeits? Of course there's going to be counterfeits. Most of us aren't going to go counterfeiting. I mean, come on.
Look,
Yeah,
right.
It's going to be just like TSA, right? It will be, if you ask me, I mean, it's a TSA thing. If you want to get in, you have it on your phone. And I think this is where technology is going to pay off big.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
And I can tell you this new generation of vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer, BioNTech, which is mRNA, which is essentially a genetic code. It is nothing like the problems that the olden days vaccines had, which was taking a virus and essentially diminishing its capacity and then injecting the person still with a virus. A lot of people oppose that. This is basically like a software pack that goes to your healthy cells and creates the antibodies in order to be prepared.
I'm gonna jump in with one question from one of the guests today, and then we're gonna end with maybe a little bit of a Thanksgiving motif. So one of our panelists, who happens to be over 60 years old, and we talked about, Sean, the Barrington approach. Is that what it's called, Barrington?
The Great Barrington Declaration, correct?
Right. So his question is that if you isolate people over 60 or so, will the affected that they might be disregarded and be sort of left behind professionally, consciously, unconsciously? And what about the collateral damage to that generation?
Okay, so let me correct the person who asked the question. That's not what I said, and that's not what the Great Barrington Declaration says. I said people over 60 who have comorbidities, who have other risks. Let me tell you something. You should not go out if you are 75 years old and you suffer from obesity, diabetes, and cancer. You should not go out into an environment where you can contract the virus, period,
Right.
until you get vaccinated. That's 6 months from now. So there's
Right.
so when you look at just that component, look at how many people have passed away, right? You're talking about 250,000 people out of.
And by the way, I would also say, Phil, a flip side of that coin that Sean describes, we were talking before we began about the schools. We've got a generation of school children who have basically learned nothing since March. And I was joking, but it's not a joke. There's studies now out that they've learned basically nothing.
Right.
And I said, if you'd asked me in February, could the American school system get worse? I'd have said no. I'd have been wrong, but
Right.
I'd have said no.
Right.
We found a way to make it worse.
Right.
By the way, I'm 69, almost 70 years old. If you said I got to take a bit of a hit so that our future generation can actually learn, life is that way.
I'll end with a story. So I'm originally from Maryland. In Maryland, every 17 years, there's this freak thing that happens. It's called cicadas. Cicadas are these buzzing insects that somehow pop out of these trees that come out, and it's sort of like, it's almost like a plague that hits for about 2 or 3 weeks, and it's very loud and annoying. But once they actually die down, you're like, wow, that was really amazing. So I'm reminded, as we're thinking about this transition of presidents, and the last time that we had a president-elect that didn't, or maybe potentially a loser that didn't accept, was Al Gore. So Al Gore tells the following story about the former Senator Bill Bradley, Senator of New Jersey, that Bill Bradley was at a gala event. He was going to be the main speaker. And right before he got up to speak, the waiter was going around to the different guests, and he was, there was, I guess, some mashed potatoes or a potato, whatever, and he was putting like a scoop of butter at each person's plate. So Bill Bradley asked the waiter, can I get another scoop? And the waiter said, sorry, the instructions I got was each guest gets 1 scoop. And Bill Bradley looked at him sitting down in his chair, and he says, do you know who I am? I'm the Senator of New Jersey. I'm a former NBA basketball legend. Today I sit on the tax, and finance committee, and yada, yada, yada. And the waiter looked at him and says, with all due respect, you know who I am? I'm in charge of the butter. And the point of this, I guess the point of the story is, hopefully maybe the next time that the 4 of us get a chance to chat, we're hopefully gotten our arms around COVID and whatnot, but there has been a sense, I think, looking back a year ago from Thanksgiving to today, this sort of a general sense of just humility as we've been dealing with this cicada type, scare that has been sent down. Thank God, not every 17 years, but as Sean alluded to, maybe since the Spanish flu. And I think that humble sort of perspective has probably changed a lot of people's lives, and hopefully we don't lose that sense of humanism going forward, whether that's as a landlord or a father or a friend or, an investor or whatnot, that I think there's an overarching sense of humility as we walk into the week of Thanksgiving. So I'll end it up, if you guys want to have any comments along those lines, and then we'll call it quits.
I'll add to your list also mortgage broker and lender.
Look, the only thing I would
we're very
add,
humble, Sean. We're very humble these days. Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Bill, the only thing I would add is, as some of you may know, my wife and I have had a charitable effort with very destitute kids in Kenya for 18 years. And I would again remind people, as you head into this holiday season, that however difficult your life has been, however challenging it's been, et cetera, there are people out there who have just been stunningly challenged here and abroad. And this is a good year to be to the extent you have resources still, to be extra generous, extra kind, extra thoughtful in this season. That's all I would add, Phil.
And I guess
Very good.
what I would add is that if this has proven anything, is that we're all connected in a very real way. And this virus didn't make any distinction between borders or political party or religion or social standing or any of this stuff. And I think, jumping on what Peter said, we were having a conversation earlier today. I said, for all of us that are complaining about being locked inside, imagine the people who are locked outside that would do anything to have a place inside.
Yeah.
So, I agree with what Peter, and I'm sure what Sean thinks, which is, the blessing we've been given is the ability to understand our own morality and our own vulnerability. And we got to pay that forward. This is not much different than the great generation that went through suffering that was thrust upon them, but then came out the greatest generation. And we have that opportunity to become the greatest generation of our time.
Right, very good.
And hopefully, one of the things that this has done, to Sandy's and Peter's point, it has opened our eyes to how blessed we are and how grateful we should be. Because the fact that we're here and talking to each other and none of us ended up in a hospital, that in and of itself requires our gratitude. So hopefully going forward, we'll be even, as Peter said, more charitable and generous.
Right. Okay, good. Well, with that in mind, thank you guys again for your time, for your comments, your wisdom. Again, thanks for Fidelity Mortgage for helping to sponsor the event, and for all our viewers out there. A happy Thanksgiving and health and prosperity. Thank you very much.
And you, bless you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.